Welcome to the Evolving Masculinities Session 2. We've got three great presenters, one of whom is joining us by Zoom. But we're going to start with Kaz, and I'm going to let the presenters introduce themselves. So Kaz, take it away, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Kaz Self. I use she/her pronouns. I'm Vice Chair of the organisation called Transplant Southwest. So we are an organisation based here in Bristol. We put on an annual Pride for the trans community every year, and in fact it's coming up in November. We will actually be here in the station for our community day on the Saturday the 26th of November. But I'm going to talk about a trans woman's view on masculinity and give my own unique perspective. So I would ask that you don't take any photos of these slides, because for the first time ever I will be showing some pre-transition pictures of myself. I'm actually kind of looking forward to it in a strange kind of way. So I'm going to talk about these topics from my own perspective. What is masculinity? Being a boy, being a man, becoming a woman, and then masculinity and trans non-binary people. I put a selection of photos on the bottom there when I was a very young boy. A man with my dog, somebody with a woman, and if I could manage for the trans non-binary people, it was as Eddie is in 2016. So what is masculinity? Well, what better place to look than a whole chapter on the subject by Finn Mackay in this wonderful book. And she says defining masculinity is actually very complicated. And whole libraries have been written in the process of trying to do so. Now I simply don't have the time to research a whole load of books, so all I can do is look at this from my own unique perspective. Masculinity could be defined as showing traits of behaviour exhibited by males. So what are those behaviours? From my lens, you should watch sports, play sports, football, cricket, rugby, and you must support a football team. You've got to drink pints to excess on a pub crawl. Should be able to get down a pint in one. You need to be an expert at car mechanics. You could build a wall and carry out DIY. And it could also be defined as presenting as male. Perhaps grow a beard, wear shorts in the middle of the winter, wear one of those goddamn awful check shirts. Nobody in this room that You should declare your disgust at those men who are a bit effeminate. That's a bit gay, or perhaps that's a cock in a frog. You don't look after the kids, you don't prepare meals, and you have no concept of ironing. So masculinity is a serious business, says Finn. How does this manifest itself? Well, it could be in looks. For example, a modern hairstyle for men. Perhaps the right deodorant to match. Going into a nightclub with long hair and makeup and a nice fragrance isn't masculine, according to the norms that we live by. But in Native America, long hair and war paint would be masculine. So masculinity is about fitting in with the culture you live in. And culture is something that can be changed. And if you don't fit in, then masculinity can be deadly serious. Men are aggressive. They fight, they argue. These aren't exclusively male traits, but seeing two men fight is considered a lot more acceptable than two women. Being a boy. Some pictures of me when I was a boy. It was a long time ago. Have things changed with time? So I have to say, for me, it was a long time ago. On my 1960s council estate, I was fortunate to have boys and girls living nearby of a similar age. The boys would always play football or cricket, or play with little soldiers and with aeroplanes. The girls would play family games, mummies and daddies notably, although not in the adult sense. I enjoyed playing with both the boys and the girls. The sports were friendly rather than physical with the boys, There was more emotional connection with the girls. I think I was more relaxed making a pretend deliberate Mandy Thomas than I ever was with the boys. But it was from secondary school onwards I found my boyhood getting harder. I was physically very small. I fell way behind the boys for similar age and size. In some cases, the boys 2 years younger than me were bigger than me. And I look back at my boyhood. In the early years, there was no pressure. But then as I went through adolescence, things got worse. I lost the good friendships I had. Boys were less inclined to call on me. As I went to a boys-only school, I saw less of the girls. I still had friendships with the people I knew on the estate, but it wasn't the same. I made one new friend at secondary school, but I think he was more interested in my model aeroplane collection than me as a person. Then at 16 I had a major operation to remove my spleen. My physical incapacity afterwards led to a rather unhappy late teen experience. The fact is, I had no good friends in my late teens, and bubbling underneath was a feeling I just could not suppress, to dress in my mother's clothes at any opportunity. But what about boys today? Do they have it different? Well, of course they do. And I say that with some confidence as I have a 19-year-old son, which strikes me that the life of a boy today is a lot more complicated than it was when I was younger. A multitude of TV channels, access to the internet at a young age, a mobile phone, things accessible on that phone, the pressure to have a good phone or the latest gadgets. Perhaps my boyhood wasn't as bad after all. Being a man, the transition from boy to man, for me, was harder than the transition from man to woman. Think about that, it's quite a statement. From 16 onwards, I had fallen behind my peers, and had taken their first visits to the pub or getting girlfriends. I mainly studied, whilst I mainly studied, I was too much of a wimp to leave home to go to university. Maths, physics and engineering, drawing, what else? So I studied at home. And I started my engineering degree as a student who commuted from home. It just didn't work and I struggled. I felt badly after the first term, and I still had the urges I could not control. My dad was a very masculine person. Beers at the weekend, watch the football, bet on the horses. I felt obliged to do similar, to be masculine. Yet I'd rather have a chess game with my mother. It was about the age of 18 that the pressure built up so much that I first considered the S word. If I hadn't had a stable family and a fair degree of resilience, I think I might have done something. I didn't. I pushed on through. Pushing on through is really the story of my life. And it wasn't until I got to mid-20s that I finally became what I felt was a man. Not in any sexual sense, it just seemed to be a time when I became more confident and comfortable with myself. I got a good job, made some men friends and did men things. Was I doing big drinking sessions because I liked it? Did I enjoy the things that happened on the stag do? I didn't not enjoy them. With friendship comes experiences and laughter, and these are the things that improve your well-being. Yes, I did become a family man. I'm married. I'm still married. And I have 2 children. From a shaky start in late boyhood, by my 30s, I was the archetypal real man. But then a bit of gender dysphoria will tell you, there's only so long you can keep it in. And the pictures there are me and my daughter, and me on the bottom with some of my male friends on a night out, on a rare occasion when some girls actually put some makeup on us, and believe you me, I was actually quite ecstatic at that time. Having a woman, ask any trans woman about their experiences of gender dysphoria, of gender, and you get a unique perspective. And whilst every single person is different, I'm sure that most women will relate to what I'm about to say. There's street harassment. I was a late transitioner, and the first to admit that I'm not blessed with the good looks of youth. But believe you me, I've experienced harassment. And the thing that strikes me is that it can come from nowhere. Jogging is one example. Running is one of the few sports I can sort of enjoy. Yet I remember the time when I was out running a familiar route along a busy road, and all of a sudden I get beeped at, followed by jeering. And I can honestly say that never happened to me before, and it took me by surprise. So here's the question. What makes a man decide that a woman running alone should be the subject of his attention? And I take this further to the men at work incident. I'm out for lunchtime work, a walk at work. Something I've done many times. I've gone to a bridge that has workmen on it. And when I get reasonably close, there's a wolf whistle. The wolf whistle turns to abuse as more men start interacting with one another. And this is the thing, men can behave like wolves in a pack, egging one another on, saying inappropriate things. And I know for a fact that it's rare for men in such groups to call out that kind of behaviour. And we heard about the bystander talk, if you were in the talk next door just this morning. The impact of this is as expected. I became a lot more wary of men in the street, particularly at night, and particularly when they're in a group. And do you know, one of the scariest things that happened to me was just this year on Park Street at 3 o'clock in the morning. I was out for a night out. It was with Trans Pride, it was at a Pride event, and I hadn't planned a way home beforehand. New taxis were nowhere to be seen, and a drunken man approaches me. On this occasion, he didn't give me a lot of attention. He didn't give me much grief and staggered on his way. But here's the thing. If I had presented as masculine, there would have been no interaction whatsoever. Why do men see single females as needing all their attention? And yes, it took me until I was 56 to get my bum pinched. That was before I transitioned permanently, and I still had the strength and bravado of testosterone in my body. I chased him off and he wasn't seen again. And then there's the male gaze. As a trans woman, it can be doubly disconcerting. Are they looking at me as a woman, or have they clocked my male biology? And then the experiences what I call the damsel in distress moments, the let the lady cross the road moments, the hold the door for her moments. I find them amusing, perplexing, and affirming. Excuse me, I spent 55 years crossing the road. You really don't need to tell me what to do. And it does amuse me how I wade through security checkpoints with a cursory glance into the handbag, or get a "this way, lovely" to be ushered through the barrier at a train station. I have to say that female privilege does have its perks. So what of masculinity and trans and non-binary people? Well, I still need to check the oil in my car, yet I feel so guilty for just lifting the bonnet. I have to repair a wall outside the front of my house. As a man, it would not be an issue. As a woman, I get men coming by and ask me what kind of mortar mix I was using. It's okay, lads, I've done it before. And why shouldn't I drink a pint, watch football and like airplanes? I talked earlier about the culture for boys and men. What trans and non-binary people do are break the cultural norms. Trans people can change the definition of masculinity, make it broader, and by existing, we can show that the masculinity I experienced for most of my life can change. Now, I'm not best placed to speak for non-binary or trans men, but I have at least met many such people. And what I do recognise in trans men is a strong element of caring that goes alongside the masculine traits I described earlier. So why do we have to live as binary genders? Surely if we could take a little bit of caring, loving femininity and apply it to any man, who would be the better for it. And that's all I have to say, thanks. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Kaz. You finished perfectly on time, so I think I would like to invite a question or two now. Does anyone have, if not hold it, but does anyone have a question? Yeah.
You mentioned you've got a 19-year-old son.
Yes.
How does it feel parenting him? How do you think it makes your parenting, has it changed your parenting, being a trans woman?
So I transitioned only 4 years ago. And he's like any other boy. He has his own personality, his own traits. But one thing I will say as a parent, when he was younger, I also have a daughter who's 2 years older than him. When he used to play with my daughter's Barbies, I saw no issue in that whatsoever. In fact, I used to thoroughly enjoy it. It actually gave me pleasure to see him dressing Barbies up in and so on. So I think there's a kind of a more understanding part of my parenting to a boy but boys are boys. You can't. They've got their own personalities, and there's only so much you can do as a parent. Any more questions? No?
Okay, so in which case I'd like to invite Kevin and Iris up, please.
First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here at this wonderful conference and for all the things we already heard. We are Kevin and Iris, and we are both working at the University of Jena in Germany at the Department of Sociology. Oh, I'm very sorry. And we are both engaged in a project addressing the role of care in the lives of adolescent boys. And we are very happy to be here and to have the possibility to present some of our research findings and maybe even discuss them with you. First, in our presentation, we will give some background information on the theoretical frameworks we used or the ideas they came from, and our research design, and that we will make just very quickly so that we can have a focus on our research findings, and afterwards we will have a little conclusion. Yeah. Okay. So many of the works on the lives and the practices of boys refer to theoretical concepts of masculinity which come from Raven Connell or Pierre Bourdieu. So they are all like we already heard about hegemonic masculinity today here, and also about the male domination conception by Pierre Bourdieu. And a lot of studies are focused on these two concepts. And these two concepts help us to analyze male power and domination. But also they give us a very narrow focus. So in empirical research about young boys, about young masculinity, we see a lot of research on homosocial peer groups and under the exclusion of girls and the exclusion of femininity. And there's a big focus on risky behavior and competitive behavior between boys. So this leads us to the assumption from the theoretical research and empirical research that male adolescents do not care for themselves or do not care for others. But there's also new theories that come up, like the theory of caring masculinities, or the concept of caring masculinities, which focuses on the relation of care and masculinity, but only on adult men, and for example, something like involved fatherhood or things like this that are researched a lot, but it does not focus on boys. But we think that the adolescence is a crucial phase when it comes to the possibility of long-term transformation of masculinities. And we want to open up a new perspective and focus on boys and care and the role of care in boys' lives. And for that, to get a better overview what is going on in boys' lives and how care fits in their lives and relationships, it was clear to us that we needed them to talk to us. So we were working together with schools and working together with youth centers to have 55 boys in the age between 13 and 17 to talk with us about their lives, and 34 follow-up interviews a year later. Our sample was diverse in terms of class, in terms of race, sexual orientation, sexual identity, and the types of school. The types of school was important for us because some of the boys had to think about a future as working people, so how they will go to their working life, and others had to stay in school for like 3 or 4 years, so the perception of future is a little bit different there. And we also wanted an environment that allows the boys to talk freely and that they can set their priorities about their lives, but we still needed to get enough data about care, so we had an interview guideline which focused on family, friends, future and self-care aspects. And for analysis we use the deep hermeneutic method. It comes from psychoanalysis, or it's deeply connected to psychoanalysis, and the idea is that if you see a text and you try to get the effects, you feel your feelings about the text, what you feel about that you have can get to an unconscious level which is behind manifest text, and so you can, by this method, you can see what are desires, what are wishes that are not socially acceptable and therefore sayable, and so you can work out conflicts. And with this method we had like 20 comprehensive case studies and created a typology that Iris will now present to you in detail.
Yeah, we now come to research findings, and first of all, we found, other than some research in the area of adolescence and masculinity might suggest, that there is a lot of that care plays a crucial role in the lives of and relationship of boys, and we can see in our data many different forms of care practices in their relations, including, for example, ranging from helping parents in the household, but also supporting friends in need, caring for younger siblings, or also in the form of emotional and empathetic attentiveness to the needs of others. However, we also found that the degrees of caring in the lives of the boys we interviewed differ strongly, and that the relation between adolescence care and masculinity are very complex and has very different shapes. And we were able to identify 4 different types of care orientations that deal with this relation between care, adolescence and masculinity, and we named them, and we tried to find fitting names. Care as an everyday phenomenon, care as a crucial part of identity, focus on self as a crucial part of identity, and worries as a barrier to care. And I'll just go into a little bit of more detail there. So to begin with the first type, care as an everyday phenomenon, we see there that care presents itself as a self-evident part of everyday life, but not as a relevant aspect of the identity of the respective boys. So they seldomly talk about care practices in their lives. It doesn't really seem worth mentioning to them. On the other hand, so we do not have very pronounced attitudes towards care that we can see in the data regarding this type, and on the other hand, but we see a lot of variety of care practices in their lives. So there is care, but they do not really talk about it. So the descriptions of care are, on the one hand, are rare and not emotionally charged or in some way conflicted, and that mirrors that these boys in general do not have many or strong conflicts in their lives, which we will see in the other types that this is not always the case. So we see care in their everyday lives, but we also see some limitations that we can link to requirements that from masculinity norms and adolescence requirements. First of all, we see that that some forms of care do not really occur in this type, especially emotional attentiveness or, for example, physical closeness or emotional closeness, like practices like hugs among boys are not really possible, and there's a kind of boycott that proves as a barrier for such practices. Also, the respective boys do not really describe themselves as care receiver, only if they describe themselves as a part of a care relation as caregiver, but not as care receiver, which poses a kind of a passive position in care relations, and do not conform to social norms of masculinity and adolescence as autonomous and active. And overall we can see in this type that these masculinity and adolescence requirements lead to care not being talked about, although it is present in their lives. We move on to the second type. Care is a crucial part of identity, which is quite different to the first one. In the second type, care acts as a resource for creating an identity, we see there wide-ranging orientations and practices in the lives of the boys, and that they also talk explicitly and also proudly about their care practices. They integrate care in their self-images and describe themselves as those who care for others and are always there for others. And these strong identifications are often accompanied with a neglection of their own needs. So the own needs of the boys often are not really addressed by them. They do not present themselves as care receivers, but as very active caregivers who care about others. What is striking about this type is that the boys are confronted with considerable worries, conflicts, uncertainties in their lives, including, for example, painful experiences in close relationship, but also, for example, existential worries. And what they do is that they use this path of identifying as a caregiver, as someone who is there for others, to deal with these uncertainties. So they have a kind of identification that they can gain self-confidence of. They feel self-confidence because of this identification as a caregiver, and that helps them to deal with some uncertainties in their lives. This positive value of care for themselves does not, however, lead to a more general recognition of care. We also see here, or also a critique of masculinity. This we do not see in this type. For example, care work done by women is often not really acknowledged and sometimes also devaluated. And also, as I said before, they do not describe themselves as care receivers, so the passive, vulnerable position of care receiver is excluded from their narratives. And overall we can see that care is used by, or acts as a part of male individuation, and that those boys use to talk about care, to taking responsibilities, to care for others, as a form of constructing a kind of adult masculinity. I have to think a little quicker. I'll try my best. We have then type 3, focusing self as crucial part of identity. And here we see that there are not very defined attitudes towards care, and not very, not many care practices that we find in the data in the everyday life, and on the other hand, a very strong focus of those boys on themselves. They do have wide-ranging self-care strategies. They do know what they need for their own well-being, and this is often accompanied with self-optimization, for example, regarding school performance or future prospects, future plans, etc. Those boys mostly are from very secure, economically secure households, have broad opportunities, and to try themselves out, to try different identities, and do not have strong conflicts in their lives. And we see there that there's orientation towards social masculinity norms that are most closely to what we understand as hegemonic masculinity, a desire for autonomy. Care is not integrated in the identity construction. And there's a strong importance of homosocial circles and also exclusion of girls. This is type 3, and then we come to a last type, worries as a barrier to care. Here we do see care orientations, that they strongly care about other people, but on the other hand, we do not see many care practices, so the actual act of caring for others. And this is not because it's not acknowledged that there is a need of care for others, but it's related to the fact that those boys are confronted with significant conflicts and worries. For example, there are also boys with depression or I don't know, very strong conflict in their lives with different variations. And those intense insecurities regarding their self-image also lead to not having that much capacity to take care of others. In many respects, those boys do not conform to traditional masculinity norms, to kind of a boy code. For example, there's a good knowledge of own needs, there's a lot of discussion of own emotions, and also display of vulnerability, and these boys also position themselves as care receivers. This is the one side of the coin, and the other one is that there still are some restrictions due to masculinity requirements, because talking about emotions is still linked with shame, and they're often left to deal with problems on themselves, by themselves. So we see that masculinity norms are crisis reinforcing and consequently also hinder the capacity to care for others. I'm very sorry, I needed too much time for that.
Yeah, okay. So, in conclusion, theories of masculinity, theories of masculinity come for a good reason from critical theory, and therefore focus on the power and creation of hierarchies to understand it and to intervene it. So, these perspectives leave a blind spot. For clarity, of course, we do follow the critical studies of masculinities, but to understand men's and boys' lives to the fullest, we have to look everywhere in the everyday life and relationships of boys and men. Of course, boys do care. We can see it all the time. But it might be that the care we see is not as visible as we want it, as we wished it to be, and that they might have their own approaches on care that we simply do not understand in some ways. But we have to acknowledge that there is potential. But this potential still is just potential. Being caring does not necessarily mean to tackle traditional models of masculinity the way it is, for example, thought in the concept of caring masculinities. It does not necessarily shift or transform masculinity in any way to be caring. In some cases, like we heard, it is quite the opposite. Young males take care aspects of their lives and intertwine them in narratives which help them in constructing a traditional male identity. And this behavior comes close to the term paternalization, which we discussed a lot in these cases. And last but not least, we got to say that there is a line, and we already talked about it. It's heavily linked to gendered aspects of care. When it comes to emotions, the surveyed boys still show a lot of problems. Speaking about their emotions, it's still perceived feminine, and therefore they try to avoid it. But we also saw that boys can talk about their emotions in our interviews. They can talk about their feelings, about their inner thoughts, and do so extensively while being interviewed, while talking to us. This is something we found out while letting the boys just talk and guiding them. Interviews, and as we think other spaces that give boys the possibility to talk about themselves in an unrestricted way, help us to understand what's going on in boys' inner lives, and what we think is more important, helps them to reflect on their doings, feelings, and also on their gender. Just listening to boys led to a lot of gratitude from their side, because they don't seem to have other places to talk about them in a personal way. And it gives them a place to reflect on themselves and to realize that we as humans, and we really saw this, are all interdependent and need the care of others at some points in our lives. So, our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, so great. So I think we've heard two actually really hopeful presentations about kind of undoing, doing differently, and focusing on the things that we want to cultivate in order to change masculinity. So I'm going to ask you to pause on questions, hold those questions in your head, because I want to bring Raju in.
Okay, so hey everyone, my name is Raju. Thanks for the invite, Nate. Thanks to Kaz and Kevin and Iris for their presentations, super interesting. So yeah, I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. So I am primarily an artist and an educator, but I involved with different kind of trans activisms around trans health. and I've been part of Action for Trans Health, which is a grassroots organisation distributing resources to trans people around trans health. And I'm mainly going to share today around workshops that I facilitated. So, first of all, just to say, well, I also produced a zine called Masculine Femininities in the 2000s, and that was kind of exploring and trying to connect to other trans masculine people or dissident masculinities. And then kind of more recently, workshops called Spilling the Tea, Transforming Masculinities. And these were held in association with Healing Justice London. So we did these this summer, and there were 6 sessions. And we kind of used, they were kind of very much resource-led, so we used resources to explore, trans masculinities. So just to kind of get into the background of trans masculinity and what that even means, we're quite lucky that people who've come before have kind of debunked this kind of masculinity only being kind of linked to cis masculinity. So people like Jack Halberstam in their book Female Masculinity kind of broke that down so that masculinity also belongs to other genders. So trans masculinities refers to the plurality of trans masculine identities, a broad group of trans people who may identify as men, male, trans-masculine, non-binary, gender queer, gender-forming, masculine centre, and many more. I won't be able to describe all of those kind of variations. It also comprises of trans women as well. So for example, butch trans women. Obviously, there's some kind of difficulty and discrepancy in those kind of definitions. Like some butch trans women won't define themselves as trans masculine, and that's down to kind of the trans misogyny and transphobia that trans women face in terms of not being believed to be trans women in the first place. So, but just to kind of say that, it's very broad, and encompassing. So many people that are trans-masculine are coming to masculinity from having multiple gender expressions and experiences. Those that they were socialized with, whether they rejected them or not. And so they may query and question their and other people's masculinity. So there's this complexity of gender identity, but also experiences of gender. And I'm going to kind of share an extract. I'm going to bring in some of the resources that we looked at as well, just as extracts. I won't do too many because we don't have so much time. But I'm going to quote Thomas Page McBee, who's an author, a writer. And he says, we need to talk about masculinity. Trans men have an advantage, I found, in highlighting the toxic aspects of masculine conditioning in 2 ways. We tend to understand that we have a gender privilege, privilege hasn't rendered masculinity invisible to us. And for those of us who transition in adulthood, we are sensitive to socialization and can therefore use that sensitivity to do the hard work of identifying and refusing the worst aspects of masculinity in our own becoming if we choose to. And then he also goes to speak about disadvantages, but I'm not going to get to that just yet. So often trans-masculine people are coming to masculinity in terms of thinking about how they can reconcile masculinity. And I'm just going to share a little, especially by Daniel Loggins, Sage Clements. So hopefully you can all see that. As I navigate elements of transition which are coded as masculine, I wonder and worry over what kind of masculinity can even exist without toxicity. So, this is speaking about transition, but also, regardless of transition, this is something that often that trans-masculine people are thinking about and considering. Also, in terms of kind of dissident forms of masculinity, so there's many kind of terms, and one the current kind of term that's coming up is around tender masculinity, and some of the previous panelists have also discussed this kind of this kind of look to care, within masculinity. So tender masculinity is something that's kind of trending in a way, or has become quite popular within dissident masculinity. So there are also barriers to working through trans masculinity. So, also as a disclaimer, there is no trans universality, there is no trans truth, only our own truth. So I'm not speaking on behalf of the whole trans community. I'm sharing what came from my lived experience in being within communities, the workshops, and working within kind of trans communities. The barriers that do also come up through working to trans masculinity is sometimes a lack of community space to discuss masculinities, and this is also being described in more general with also the cis masculinity, a lack of space to really kind of to focus on that. A lot of trans people are coming from isolated, spaces, places, locations. There are online forums, there are, the online kind of communities that exist as well. But generally, in terms of physical spaces, there aren't any kind of spaces dedicated to that, and that can also be because of other focuses that come into kind of being a trans person in general, which I'll go into. Lack of intergenerational exchange. There's kind of a lack of spaces where trans people of all ages can come together and share and exchange experiences. Trans mortality rate, that's a very real reality of why that might also prevent intergenerational exchange and survival, being very focused on. Being beyond perceived cis toxic masculinity, that's a mouthful, but often trans people are coming to gender as feeling like they're beyond gender or beyond cis toxic masculinity without really necessarily addressing what that means, but already coming to that place feeling beyond that and maybe not questioning it at all in a desire to pass as a real cis man. Not that I'm saying that exists, but that can be often a perception. And also, just being unconscious about it and reproducing those toxic traits themselves as well. Prioritizing practicalities of trans health. So that being a very real experience for trans people in terms of access to trans health, whether that's in transition or outside of that, just general health and well-being, including mental health. And focus on medicalisation. So the kind of real everyday reality of medicalisation, and of course that doesn't exist for everybody within these categories. A focus on aesthetics and physical corporality, so versus emotional and spiritual well-being. So kind of being caught up in what it means to kind of look masculine. A lack of role models for diverse masculinities, and that comes into media representation. In some of the workshops we spoke a lot about this in terms of kind of who are our models, what are our models for masculinity, and many people spoke about having their models being actually their mothers, people coming from single parent households, or people you wouldn't expect to necessarily be their models for masculinity. So that was quite interesting as well, that there are these often because of a lack of kind of cis male role models or trans male models, there are models outside of that exist as well that shape masculinity. Having to constantly defend identity as valid. I think this is something I mentioned earlier in terms of kind of trans women, but this is something that also is kind of within the trans community, having to constantly defend oneself. Stops you from really focusing on what it is you want to explore and be open about. Another kind of area that we focused on was around kind of boyhood and manhood. We looked at people like Bell Hooks, and Bell Hooks kind of gives a very good critique of feminism and feminist movements when kind of the kind of feminist movement as a movement started, in terms of having to always was always located in this kind of problem place of having to defend itself as well. Having to defend itself as being valid, as well as kind of feminism only being seen as a women's issue or women's problem. And also Ben Bill Hooks also kind of critiques that in terms of that being stuck in that place, not being able to come to a place of reimagining what masculinity would be like, and also not addressing boyhood and boy being a really important kind of stage to kind of to masculinity. What is interesting with kind of trans masculinities for some trans masculine people is that we often get stuck in. So that's also another kind of contentious place of trans masculine people not being seen as men or not being seen as grown up, or always being in this adolescence phase, and that's a very common experience for some trans masculine people of being stuck in boyhood. So some people embrace that, some people reject that, right? And I don't know how much time I've got left. Nate, will you give me a heads up when I've got a minute left? And yeah, a big part also of trans masculinities is thinking through violence and harm. And so a lot of us, through these workshops, we're really thinking about what our roles are, our responsibilities, and our positionalities are to kind of patriarchy and to feminism. A lot of that is kind of thinking through violence and harm. And as trans masculine people, we're receiving and of facing violence and harm, particularly kind of state and societal violence. And medical violence, that being part of kind of the state, and also kind of this kind of carceral kind of violence, carceral state, carceral structure that exists around us. But we also are often marginalised people, and we have to also kind of also think through the lines of responsibility and accountability of experiencing harm, but also perpetuating harm. And there not being many resources within communities, or communities not being resourced to tackle the kind of levels and intensities of harm that we face. Not being able to often be honest and vulnerable about those experiences of violence and harm, whether they're being perpetuated or experienced, not being believed as experiencing harm as masculine people, being kind of perceived as perpetrators, and we looked at kind of a couple of resources around that, looking at kind of transformative justice frameworks, and trans justice frameworks are, born from the US, also kind of stem outside of that, but are really looking to kind of deal with harm by not causing harm or looking at harm reduction. Again, with trans people having to defend ourselves and defend our identities from kind of being critiqued, from oppression that we face, it can be very difficult for us to be open and honest about the violence that exists within our communities as well. So I think I'll end there. I didn't share many resources, but let me see if I'll share one more. I'll end with one resource from The Revolution Starts at Home, which kind of sums this up quite well. So this is by Anna Lara, and it says, people of colour, queers, genderqueers, we are the living proof that we do not accept institutionalised forms of violence as inherently true or valid, that we believe in our own worth and right to live on our own terms. We already have the basic framework for making those connections between our own experiences and those of our communities and outside violence. And then it says, healing from our personal experiences is not just a matter of health, but also about social change. Our communities have suffered lifetimes of abuse, from slavery to police brutality, and the work that is required to undo the internalised and externalised forms of expression is not just about what we do in the streets, in not-profits or community groups. It's also about how prepared we are to deal with the fallout of our circumstances and personal experiences. It is hard work to do this. It is really hard. When we're aware of our own pain and work to uncover its sources, we become our best allies to our own healing, and we can become stronger in our community work. So I'll end with that. But yeah, just to kind of say, also, someone else kind of brought this in. I think I understand Kevin brought this in earlier. There's also intersections of kind of class, race, and other factors that come into play, which haven't gone into huge detail about, but just to acknowledge that those play a huge part in the experiences of transmasculine people.
Thank you, Raju. Okay, I'd like to invite all the presenters back up for questions.
I want to know where you got your t-shirt.
My t-shirt's from Mexico. There's a collective here who made them.
Okay, so I guess in this session we've been hearing about kind of, I think this thread of care has actually kind of run through, and for me with Raju, within your presentation, there's this question of kind of to what extent we're undoing versus redoing or doing differently, and I think this is from what I've heard, this is a question that comes up for a lot of for people in transition or who have transitioned or who are doing gender differently. And it's, I think that one of the images that you shared of like, if so much of masculinity is harmful, can something be rescued? And, it's like, are we going to practice it so differently such that it becomes irrecognizable? And I wonder if any of you had a comment on that undoing versus redoing or doing differently tension.
Well, on the care aspect, I reflect on my life, and I have to say I've had more hugs in the last 4 years, including some period of lockdown, than I've had in the previous 55 years of my life. And I think there's some really important points you make there. When I look back from my life, as I say, from that experience I had with the girlfriend when I was young, where we'd play these games of mummies and daddies, and it's sort of a caring sort of game. And then when I eventually became a carer myself by becoming married and having children, those were times of my life when I was actually quite content. And the period of my life when I was actually most unhappy was that adolescence period as a boy going into man, when perhaps there wasn't so much care in my life. I was fortunate I did have a loving environment. I was able to turn to my parents. But I kind of wonder for other sort of boys turning into men, if they don't have this caring aspect of their life, where do they turn? And potentially they do turn in the wrong way, to violence or anger. And so maybe we want to sort of try to explore that in some way.
Yes, so one of the things that really stood out for me in your presentation, and correct me if I'm wrong or I kind of misheard this, but that those boys who are focused on self as a critical part of their identity, who also had a substantial amount of privilege, had the lowest caring practices. And so I guess it's really interesting. That kind of terrified me, given the sort of self-culture that so many people of all genders are exposed to through multiple media, but especially through social media, especially for young people. And questioning if that is kind of negatively impacting on our propensity to care for one another. It sort of makes sense, but to actually find that in the data, is that what you found?
Yeah, for us also it was really interesting because there was kind of a thesis at the beginning of our project, or some literature also has this thesis that if you're capable to really take good care of yourself, then you're capable to care for others. And we did not find that is automatically the case. So just the focus on self-care, and I think that there is also a critique on how the discourse is on self-care right now does not necessarily mean that we learn to take responsibility also for the needs of others. This was, I think one striking aspect of that, and I would agree that this relation to privilege is very, very strong here, and
I also think that the background of privilege is very important in this stuff, because we saw that in more troubled families, more troubled boys, more troubled communities with more problems, or like lower class boys living with a low socioeconomic background, they need to care for family members because parents are working. So, and if the boys in a privileged situation, the parents are not working, somebody can cook for them. In most cases, it's the mother that stays home, and the father that has this one adult breadwinner type of conversation. And what I think is terrifying about that is that these people are upper class people that go to university, that go to and everything, and that they will sometime be in maybe high places. They live a like normal life with having kids and everything, and reconstructing all the things because they never learned how to care in the first place, because they didn't need to learn how to care in the first place. And so we hope that in some place or in some time they will learn how to do it, but also we don't want women to tell them how to care in relationships again, because this is also in theory a lot of a thing that happens a lot, that you say boys do care and do learn how to take care of others in adolescence because they have first contacts with girls in relationships where they say, but you have to talk about your feelings. And so this is again not. We need to find a way to. I guess we need to find a way to have boys being in positions where they do have to do care work and care for others, and to learn this in some way. And this needs individual changes in family, a whole system approach like we saw in the last presentation, and also a cultural change, because culture can be changed. This is
sorry. I was just going to kind of respond quickly and just say, well, you know, if we're thinking about kind of the individual and how we can and cannot care, we have to look at wider systems and cultures that exist that we're being socialized within. You know, and cross-culturally it will vary in terms of kind of care and how that's kind of exchanged, familial kind of settings and all of that. But also capitalism. In your kind of presentation, Kevin and Raju, you were saying that the boys were aware of their kind of their identities in terms of self-care, but it was very much about image or what were their achievements or success, and that's very kind of driven by this kind of capitalist logic of like your worth is kind of tied to what you can achieve or what, you know, rather than your emotional well-being, how you're treated, how much, as Kaz said, whether you receive hugs, you know, all these kind of very basic kind of levels of caring that we experience. So I think we have to look, masculinity for me isn't just about, or opening up isn't just about how we identify or what we say we are. It's more about these systems and cultures and structures that exist around us and challenging them or changing them.
I'm just going to build on that point actually, because it's taken me a while to process your presentation actually, but it strikes me now as kind of like almost like deeply disruptive really, because when you think about care as like a really fundamental principle, it challenges a lot of our kind of political thinking and political systems, doesn't it, which are kind of almost rooted in this idea of individual, or the primacy of the individual really, and then I guess more recently about kind of consumerism and the work of the individual, as you were just saying. So actually really focusing on care is a very political act, really, isn't it? And trying to, as you've done, really understand what it is about boys and caring, you know, in order to potentially change that. And I guess you're finding about the more privileged boys perhaps being less involved in care also supports that finding, really. So, sorry, that's more of an observation than a question, but really, really fascinating, so thank you.
Okay.
I was going to say as well that it's really great, brilliant paper. I loved it, and I loved the research. And I thought it was interesting that, did I get this right, that you said the respondents didn't talk, you know, that much about care from a passive position, so it was sort of invisible. And I think that goes to the heart of all these kind of sexist cultural assumptions that we expect boys to be looked after. It's almost so normal, it's invisible. You know, boys get mothered, boys attract a maternal attitude, and it's there as a constant in the background that it becomes invisible. They don't even speak about it because it's seen as natural and normal. And I suppose, you know, it's that essentialism that we need to remove from that. So everyone is cared for, you know, all children are looked after in that way and cared for, and we de-gender that.
Yes.
It becomes just part of the community and being part of the human community.
Yeah, I was thinking about that one as well, and it struck me as like, what would be the workshop activity with boys and young men that would kind of come out of that, and sort of thinking, how am I cared for, like listing the ways that I'm cared for, because it's so disarming because of the autonomy point, and like it's a recognition of your lack of autonomy, that none of us are autonomous, and it's sort of like, I was thinking, I wrote down like celebrating care or something like that to get people thinking about it. Monica, I think Monica was next.
Okay, you're gonna have to come back.
Yeah.
Are you going to remember?
Yeah.
Okay. No, because it has happened to me before. And I wrote down my questions. Yeah. So, because otherwise you could go first. Yeah, so first of all, I'm just like, probably this is slipped. I didn't pay attention, but your research was about in Germany,
It was
right?
in Germany, yes. It was.
Okay. Yeah, so I was going to like to see like I'm curious if you did some kind of comparison between like more extended families towards more nuclear oriented families, whether they care more or less, or did you like kind of compare pretty much what are privilege, but already in Germany so?
It wasn't really very systematically because the sample was not large enough for those small distinctions, but it was a quite diverse sample within Germany, of course. But I don't know if there was something. We did not have many cases where they were included in a larger family. I don't know, community. I think. But we had some. No, I couldn't say right now. I thought we would have to look into it.
I think there were a few cases where brothers lived around or other siblings lived around in flats that were near to the parents, but there wasn't the difference that was there for us was that, yeah, okay, then I go there after school before I come home, but it wasn't something about caring. And what we had differentiated for Germany is like Eastern Germany, so the former GDR, and Western Germany, to see if there are differences, because the care regimes in these different states were different, and if this has still an impact on today's care activity. So this was one of the things we wanted to look at.
Okay, well, second question was more for any of you, like on screen or here. Where you noticed like whether there was more or less care like before or after transiting? Like were you expected to care more or less? Was it like really obvious? Is it clear my question?
I think I understand it.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of already said that, I've had more hugs in the last 4 years than I've had before. And that's an act of self-care. Also, I think as a trans person, you need to seek out care in whatever form it can take. And as was said, it could be online, it could be in your community, and that's something, that in the previous life I would never ever have done. I would kind of sort out any kind of care from perhaps a masculine community, because I didn't want to be part of a football team. I hated football. Some men find your football team as their care on Saturday afternoon, or be it part of to watch a football game is their act of self-care. But not all men are the same. So for some men, there's just maybe a bit of a void of activity where they can find the care that they need. But yeah, for me, transitioning is, and I look at the what that wheel called this morning.
The feelings wheel.
The feelings wheel. I was actually looking at that. I basically transitioning for me in terms of self-care. It took me from the dark blues and purples to the bright, glowy, happy space. And that was so lovely. I really enjoyed that this morning.
Folks, I'm afraid we are out of time. Carl, you had a.
It's okay, if we're out of time, I'm fine.
Or like quick comment. Could you catch that into a comment?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Well, firstly, I genuinely thank people for what I've learned from this today, to be honest with you. I know people give quite a lot of themselves to help people like maybe myself learning. Having trained in youth work back in the 80s, it was really interesting because at the time, that training was very much familiar around understanding society and discriminations within society, sexism, heterosexism, and recognising it as a youth worker, as a male youth worker, and as a white youth worker. But I now had a professional responsibility to actually challenge and promote and help young people become more conscious of the way society is structured, what their place is within that, and also how to, in a sense, open up their own development potential. And when it came, and that was also working with young men for me, and recognising that we have a responsibility now to try and do this work with young men back then that is much more emotionally intelligent and actually helps young men to explicitly start to understand the concepts of discrimination, their own behaviour and how they've been discriminated against, and to try and broaden masculinity. I guess I haven't been doing enough of that, and I've always known, I've always tried to do that and done bits of it, but I've never done it as consistently as I believed I should have done from the way I was trained, because I think I was trained to say, don't back away from this, you can't back away from it, you need to do it. But all the time I've been thinking, my goodness, this is, how is this ever going to change? How is society ever going to sort of change enough to create the sort of equality and the sort of growth space everybody needs to grow to be people they are? And I've said, it's this thing you were saying actually about transitioning and transforming. I'm just thinking, like, for me, that people in our society now that have transitioned or are trans, there's something transformational about it, not just for individuals, but for society. And it's a bit like saying, okay, you youth workers like me, you've had your chance, right? You've had the chance to actually really open up people's masculinity, to open up young men to recognising the way that they are perpetuating the sort of oppressions that are part of, not just oppressing women, but oppressing themselves as well. You failed actually. And if we carried on with that, it wouldn't ever change. And so it feels like now we're into this new epoch where people are saying, well, that thing you're trying to help young people broaden, we're actually going to break out of altogether. We're going to demonstrate that actually those constraints actually don't deserve to exist. And I just find that amazingly transformational. And you're achieving something that we will be very grateful from here on into the future, really, in a way that we could never have brought that about ourselves, without people being brave enough to say it's no longer a box, I want to broaden, I don't want it to exist. And I just think that's brilliant. And thank you for that.
Yeah, I think it's important that, to state that I have no desire to turn boys and men into women to make them more caring. I think men can actually be caring. And by challenging gender stereotypes, by being positive role models, by all the things we've spoken about today, we can create a cultural change. And for me, that can be positive for men and boys, and for women, and for people in general.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.